Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Laveau. Protests, democracy demands, outside meddling, regime change, and the future of China. All of these issues have put Hong Kong in the spotlight. Have the students and Beijing both blinked at this point? And what is next? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Martin Jakes. He is the author of When China Rules the World. We also have Andrew Leung. He's the CEO of Andrew Leung International Consultants Limited, a company founded in London and reincorporated in Hong Kong. And sitting with me here in Moscow is Mark Sleboda. He is an international affairs and security analyst. Martin, if I can go to you first. When you look at the hierarchy of issues related to the protests in Hong Kong, what is the most important issue to you? Is it really a deficit of democracy? Is it the economy? It's Beijing worried about the periphery? What's your take? What's the most important issue?
Well, I think the most important issue is the issue of governance of Hong Kong, and in this context, the issue of democracy, and which means, in this context, the electoral law and how the 2017 election is going to be organized. But of course, one cannot understand this issue in the abstract, and we have to have a clear understanding of what happened in 1997, the notion of one country, two systems, what is the relationship between China and Hong Kong, how has it been changing, and how has Hong Kong itself been changing.
Andrew, do you want to pick up on that? Because the Western media likes to use the democracy issue, and I think all of us here on the panel would agree that the democracy is an issue, but it's not the only issue. Others will look at it as Hong Kong making some kind of play of its own identity. It's an identity issue as it is absorbed slowly into China proper. How important is that?
Well, it is extremely important, the identity issue. And then this question of identity is well captured in a video short of the New York Times showing a young girl, a lady protester, and she probably educated abroad. And she realizes that that's the students know that they can't change the system. But they have certain ideals, because they ideals about democracy, about freedoms, and a lot of these young students, they were born after the handover. They've not experienced the kind of colonial rule, old timers like me, have lived through, and can compare the kind of freedoms Hong Kong have been enjoying since the handover with what it was under the colonial rule. I mean, Hong Kong has been voted the freest economy in the world for the 20 years in a row by the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Now, you can't have being voted the freest economy in the world without a vibrant civil society, without the freedoms and liberties underpinning a free economy. So that's, people are wondering, so why all this protest all of a sudden? So
all of a sudden, okay, let me go to Mark here, because Andrew, I'm really glad you brought up that video, because I saw a similar video, 6 months ago, Mark, about a Ukrainian girl, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Mark, why don't you tell our listeners? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we saw this video of a Ukrainian girl who actually didn't turn out in the end, of course, to be a Ukrainian girl, by a Western production company that has intimate links in with certain political forces that are well known for exploiting dissent in foreign countries within Western governments.
Okay, so ergo, what are you saying?
It's a playbook. This is a rule from a playbook. There is a definite script being written out here, and I think it's quite disingenuous that certain political forces in Hong Kong and abroad are exploiting the idealism of, and the faces, most importantly, of 15, 16, and 17-year-old students.
One of the things that's very interesting, if I can go back to Martin, one of the things in looking at Western media coverage of what's going on in Hong Kong, you keep coming across the word, they're so cute, aren't they? They're so cute. The white paper discussing the 2017 election, is this a red herring? Or is this really something so important to these young people? Because we had the political forces in Hong Kong, and then all of a sudden the students came and kind of grabbed the mantle here and pushed it forward. How important was that white paper?
Well, I think the white paper is very important in the sense that it became the focus, if you like, for some discussions and debates in Hong Kong about where Hong Kong was going. Now, I think it's very important here to understand that Hong Kong was a colony for 155 years, and when the proposal came of one country, two systems from the Chinese, which was an extremely innovative proposal, which is deeply unfamiliar to the West, and which the Western media coverage of Hong Kong makes absolutely no attempt to try and understand. I mean, the superficiality of the coverage and the failure to provide any kind of historical context is hardly new to us, but nonetheless, it's been pretty breathtaking in this instance. Now, the thing is that the problem, I think, in Hong Kong is, of course, Hong Kong traditionally did not look to China in the colonial era. They looked westwards. They didn't look particularly northwards. I mean, there was a section of the population that looked northwards. And economically, of course, they had to look northwards because that was where its bread was buttered so well in the 20 years or so prior to the handover. But basically, I think Hong Kong is pretty ignorant about China. A lot of people in Hong Kong are pretty ignorant about China. They don't relate to China particularly. They look down on the mainlanders. This is a very, very powerful cultural phenomenon over a long period. Why do they look down on the mainlanders? They think the mainlanders are, poor, inferior, badly educated, badly dressed. I mean,
and they also drive up real estate prices too, don't they?
I mean, I think that there's the growing pains of the relationship one country, two systems, and the fact that there's been a lot about two systems and very little about one country, which I think partly China could have done more about, but, that's another question. And then there is what's happening to Hong Kong. Now, in 1997, the Hong Kong economy was 18% the size of Chinese economy. In other words, nearly a fifth. Today, it's 3%. And so there is also the question of just, what Hong Kong is becoming less and less important and to China. I mean, it's important to China, but not like it was. And it's going to become, imagine in 20 years' time, it's going to be a tiny percent of the Chinese economy. So Hong Kong, I think, is still struggling to work out what it is and what its relationship with China is going to be. And it's having to come to terms with the fact that the kind of hubris that was shown by Hong Kongers in the period, particularly the 20 years from about 1978 to 1997 and the handover, that was a particular era when Hong Kong got lucky because China started its great reform program and China was still not open. So Hong Kong had this transient moment when it was the gateway to China, and that's not true anymore.
Andrew, over the last few days, Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong, of the British Empire, ruling over the island, he said very publicly that Britain has the right to intervene in the internal affairs of Hong Kong when it comes to the issue of democracy. Now, the irony of that is breathtaking to me.
Yeah, well, of course
I very much agree with that. I mean, I think Patten, to be blunt about it, Patten was a very poor governor of Hong Kong because he wasn't the governor of Hong Kong, he was grandstanding.
Well,
okay, let me go to Andrew on this one here. Go ahead, Andrew. Go ahead, jump in.
No, I worked in Hong Kong all my life. I mean, my career, 38 years before and after the handover. I even worked to Chris Patten and accompanying him in certain visits before the handover. But I think that the conundrum in Hong Kong is that all this rise of identity in Hong Kong, and it doesn't square with the risks Beijing sees of allowing all these youngsters, all the Democrats, have their own way and trying to elect someone whom Beijing may suspect of being subversive and whom Beijing may not trust, who is likely, in the eyes of Beijing, going to lead Hong Kong towards separatism. So these worries are not...
Andrew, if I could jump in here. I mean, my panel here is very knowledgeable and experts on China. I am kind of an interloper, I have to admit. But in looking over at the handover and the agreement of the handover, China has about 50 years, meaning until 2047 for a complete, full elections and free elections. And so isn't everyone kind of jumping the gun? I mean, it was pre-agreed to in 1997.
No, I think to be fair, Hong Kong was handed over back to China in 1997. It's now almost 17 years. So I think that Hong Kong people have a right to demand, for universal suffrage. But the irony is that universal suffrage was not included in the Joint Declaration in the first place.
Exactly. Thank you for pointing that out.
But it was Beijing who took the initiative to introduce the idea of universal suffrage in the basic law, which is Hong Kong's mini constitution. And Beijing promised universal suffrage is going to happen in 2017. But as I was saying, under the one country, two systems formula, don't forget one country, meaning a country under the one party rule, two systems, Hong Kong with its own separate identity, embracing Western values and so on and so forth. There are safeguards in the basic law on how the election is going to take place. That would be a nominating committee, which is broadly representative of Hong Kong society and the economy. What are these sectors involved in this broad representation? They are the business sector, the professional sector, the grassroots sector, and the politicians. Now, you can't say that such a committee, regardless of the number, is not broadly representative. And then the Hong Kong government, and of course the Beijing government also, supports a consultation on how this committee, how this process is going to be made more open and democratic. That's subject to consultation, but all the safeguards in the basic law have got to be complied with. Now the activists and the students say, forget about the basic law. Any committee screening candidates is not democratic. This is the crux of it here.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Mark Sleboda is sitting next to me. You've been very patient. Go ahead.
First of all, I would like to disagree a little bit with one of our earlier guests who says there's no precedent for a one country, two system policy within the West, because very much right now we are looking at the devolution of the United Kingdom into a one country, two system rule between the government in London. Although complete independence was denied, there is promised measures for even further autonomy and devolution of powers to Scotland. So if we take a look at such policies as education, healthcare and stuff, they are becoming increasingly, rather dramatically divorced from the reality that the rest of the United Kingdom exists under, where education is not free, but rather quite expensive. So we are very quickly looking at the United Kingdom itself.
But how does that help us understand Hong Kong then?
Well, so this one country, two system is not unique. It has a precedent in the rest of the world. The exact way this is constructed is and will evolve, is still undergoing process. But these protests were premised on a technicality of democracy. It's not like the people of Hong Kong are denied democracy. As has been pointed out, by a whole host of measures, it is already an extremely democratic, prosperous society. So this is over the composition of a 1,200-member standing committee. We're not talking about some smoking room with 10 people deciding who the nominees will be, about the exact composition over. This is the technical reason for the protest, but this is being blown up out of all proportion. And I said these students are terribly being exploited by certain political forces. And when you have these political forces in Hong Kong that have undeniable, documented, well-videoed connections with such neoconservative figures in the United States as Paul Wolfowitz, you really have to take a step back and say, oh, what is the big picture? What is going on here? What foreign political forces are exploiting this domestic situation? And we have heard repeatedly that what happens in China, in Hong Kong, is not China's business. And China itself has taken a step back and allowed the authorities in Hong Kong to work out what's going on there. But if it's not China's business, it most certainly isn't the United States' business. It's not the United Kingdom's business. It's no one else's business in the world, the way the particulars of democratic methodology evolve in Hong Kong, between Hong Kong, their authorities, and the government in Beijing.
Martin, if I can go back to you, if I can kind of just combine some of the comments that Andrew and Mark have just made here. Again, looking at what the Beijing authorities have done, is they've had quite a few careful steps. I mean, they certainly know what direction they want to go in. Again, this white paper looks like it was a tipping point for the students, and as Mark maybe alluded to here, is other forces here. Is this a technicality issue that is hiding something much broader?
Well, yes. I mean, yes and no. I mean, it's obviously important. I think it's the umbrella for, as it were, is the fact that a very significant section of the Hong Kong Chinese still don't feel that they're part of China. So what they see is two systems in a sort of implicit fashion, or some now I notice even a little bit more explicit fashion. They don't see one country. So we've got the sort of the growing pains, I would suggest, of a new kind of relationship. Now, I think it's very important. I'd like to underline what Andrew said about the fact that it was not the British, it was not the West that paved the way for universal suffrage. The British had controlled Hong Kong for 155 years after they seized it at the conclusion of the Opium Wars. And at no stage did they introduce democracy of any serious character. There was no universal suffrage. The governor, including the final one, Chris Pan, who was a member of the British Conservative Party, was always selected by the British government. The Hong Kong people never had any say in that. And it was the Chinese, as Andrew points out, that introduced the idea of universal suffrage and later specified 2017.
Martin, if I could jump in here, I'm very glad you're saying this for our listeners here, because as an expert on China, and again, When China Rules the World, I think everyone listening here should pick that book up because it's an excellent book to read. What you just said, I don't see being reported in Western media at all.
And it's not. I mean, there is a complete absence of this kind of reportage. That the assumption that's made, the cliched assumption that's made in Western media discussion, and I include in this the broadsheets, I mean, it's not just the tabloid press, it's pretty universal, it includes the BBC, never puts it in any kind of historical context. The assumption is, China is against democracy, and the West, brackets Britain, is for democracy. And, this is historically not true. The British did not.
And dangerous, and very dangerous, I would say, as well. Andrew, again, looking at Western media coverage of this story coming out of Hong Kong, the number of times I've come across the historical reference of Tiananmen Square in 1989. It's constantly made reference to. And I would also, as a footnote to my own comment, it's coming out of journalists that have gone afoul of the Beijing authorities over the last 20 years. And it seems to me it's their chance to give Beijing the boot, because looking at what's going on in Hong Kong today, or the last few weeks, and looking at the historical event of Tiananmen Square in 1989, I see no parallel whatsoever. But Western media will not tell you that. Go ahead.
Well, I think that all the Western media has forgotten about the one country and just concentrated on the two systems. Now, I need to throw in a bit of balance here. The one country, two system formula is truly unique. You just can't compare it with Scotland and the United Kingdom, because the one country belongs to a different system, a different rule, the concept of the liberties and freedoms in the West. I mean, it's a completely different system. And where is the Scotland and the United Kingdom? Of course, they embody the same kind of laws, the British law. But in the one country system, you're talking about two political systems. So that's the uniqueness of it all. Now, secondly, the white paper, of course, is according to the activists, is the last straw on the back of a camel, because it was a rising kind of identity. But then you will look at the white paper, it no more than encapsulates what are all the safeguards in the basic law. It's never gone beyond the basic law. Again, this is being played up. Now, as far as the kind of Beijing suspicions are concerned, and a lot of people would say, well, you're just being too suspicious. I mean, Hong Kong people would never want to separate itself from the mainland, and there is no foreign influence involved. But then in Hong Kong, recently, only about a couple of months ago, it was widely reported that what the owner of the most anti-Beijing, anti-establishment newspaper, the Apple Daily, he was found out to be the only source, the only funding source of all these activists. He has given even 20 million Hong Kong dollars to the Bishop of Hong Kong, the Catholic Bishop, during his bishopric. And what has the Catholic Bishop got to do with 20 million Hong Kong dollars during his bishopric? I mean, so
that's very interesting.
So that underlines the fact. Well, I'm not saying that all this is concrete evidence of foreign intervention. And again, in RT television, it was mentioned also that the American National Democratic Institute, the NDI, was known to be funding a program in the University of Hong Kong where the Professor Benny Tai, is the leader of the anti-Occupy movement.
Well, according to the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, to their own website, they have given $460,000. Now, it didn't make it particularly clear if that's cumulative or in 1 year, but nonetheless, that's not, I wouldn't call that pocket change. Mark, what are they using that money for, to buy paper cups?
Well, anyone who has actually been involved in protest movements, as I have been in the United States, United Kingdom, Europe, and even here in Russia, is that logistics are extremely important. These types of occupations of territory, a very non-traditional means of protests, they aren't spontaneous. All right, they require large infrastructure and organization beforehand. Food and water has to be guaranteed. Laboratory facilities have to be ascertained. Medical supplies, legal things. These are not something that sprang up overnight. They were carefully scripted. They're organized. That doesn't take away from the genuine sentiment that many of these children, however idealistically and naively, may feel about what they're doing, but they are script players. They are extras in a larger screen event that is taking place. Now, if we want to talk about Western media coverage of what's going on in Hong Kong, of course, it's entirely one-sided. But if there's one thing we can take away from all of this, it's that China's response to the protests there make clear how undemocratic a country it is. Because as we have seen from the events in Ferguson, from the events of the
please explain the reference.
Yes.
Please explain.
Of Ferguson, Missouri, where there were riots over the killing of a black student just earlier this year in the United States, where the U.S., the political authorities there pulled out actually military gear in order to put down these protests. I mean, heavy that was previously used in Iraq. The Occupy Wall Street repressions in the United States, the brutal put down of the anti-neoliberal austerity protests across all of Europe. These peaceful protesters were put down with rubber bullets, truncheons, tear gas, pepper spray, LRAD sound cannons, and then after the protests were put down, the laws were put in place to prevent this type of occupation protests.
What you're saying is China has
again.
good company.
I'm not saying China has good company. I'm saying that China has not lived up to the bill of what real democracies do to repress peaceful political protest movement. China needs to take lessons from Ferguson and from New York City and Oakland in order how to properly restore law and order with a forceful hand rather than this rather democratic process.
You're being very ironic.
Yeah.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Martin, if I could go to you, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this program is that when there was a coup in Ukraine earlier this year, of course, the Russians were very suspicious why a country with so much Western money invested into it, particular opposition figures, all of a sudden there's this violent overthrow of a democratically elected government. And now if I were sitting in Beijing looking at what's going on in Ukraine, and then all of a sudden this flare-up in Hong Kong, I probably would be suspicious. Would you be?
Well, I don't think that's the main reason why the protests are developed. I mean, I do know, I do share the view that, of course, there's a sort of pro-Western lobby and presence within Hong Kong, which is hardly surprising given the place's history. And I've spoken at many meetings in Hong Kong, and one of the characteristics is, or frequently anyway, is a sort of pro-Western lobby that hasn't really changed its tune since the handover. If I was in Beijing, I mean, I think that China's handling of Hong Kong is very cautious, actually. And, from the beginning, they've been aware that with the basic law and so on, that Hong Kong needed to be treated differently and sensitively and patiently. And I think that their handling of Hong Kong has been very patient, but also clear, and that is they don't want to create a problem for themselves. They don't want to end up with an electoral law that at some point means that there is even the slightest possibility that the candidate, a very Chinese, essentially sort of pro-independence candidate was elected. I mean, I think that's their red line, if you like, and that's understandable because
that's understandable.
How
Absolutely.
Is that one country, two systems? That would just become two systems. So I think that the Chinese are patient. I would go a little bit further than this and be slightly critical of the Chinese in that not because of the Western allegations about the Chinese being assertive and so on in Hong Kong, but rather the opposite. Which is, I mean, I was in Hong Kong at the time of the handover. I lived there from 1998 to 2001. And the extraordinary thing is that there was virtually no sign of Chinese presence. After the handover, I remember just seeing one Chinese flag. I'm not saying there weren't any more, but I didn't see any in Hong Kong. And basically, the arguments for one country and the relationship and so on have been left to the Hong Kong authorities. And I think they display sort of, historically, the administration and the way the government works is still quite colonial in its mentality. It's still got not surprisingly, those kind of characteristics because that's the tradition and so on. But it's not really a political leadership. So the argument for the relationship with the mainland and so on isn't made strongly. It's made rather weakly. And they haven't really developed a new kind of leadership, a new presence. I mean, there's no Chinese, there are organizations that are pro-China, but there isn't a presence of, for example, the Chinese Communist Party in Hong Kong, except in a very distant way or very much in the wings. So I think that this is a question, really, for the Chinese, not to become vulgar or heavy-handed about it, but to find a way of their presence being there and persuasive. I think it's the question of persuasion that's needed,
Andrew, I want to go to you. There seems to be a lull in the action right now. What's going to happen next? Because one could make the argument that both sides have blinked and they're just going to wait until the next round, whenever that may be.
No, I think the students know that kind of highly disruptive on a massive scale is unsustainable to the rest of the Hong Kong public. I mean, who've got to go about their ordinary businesses. People got to go to work, and then the street, so sellers have got to sell their stuff, and then the shops have got to open. So I think that I would say the majority of the Hong Kong people, they just don't want this kind of disruption, even though most of them want more democracy. Who doesn't want more democracy? I mean,
that's a really good point. We're almost out of time. Mark, I think the way Andrew just phrased it there is just absolutely perfect. First of all, we don't have the majority are backing this, but the majority want the system to evolve according to their needs and desires. There's nothing wrong with that.
These student protesters, they've had their say. It's time for their opinions to be taken account and for the grown-ups to take over and enter into negotiations here, because the majority of the people of Hong Kong are not represented by these student protesters. New York Times polls reported in New York Times have clearly showed that the majority of the population, while somewhat sympathetic to the protesters, now wants them to go home and wants business to be able to be conducted in Hong Kong again. The anti-Occupy movement has been completely ignored and slandered without any evidence in the Western press, and many times this has dwarfed the Occupy movement itself, and that certainly looks to be the case right now. And the final end result of all of this, of course, we're not going to see any kind of revolution. It's ridiculous, but that's the way the Western media has been trying to hype up what's happening in Hong Kong and in China. But the end result of this is China is going to take careful note of U.S. political money and influence interfering in what should be a purely domestic event.
All right, Mark,
and they're going to draw closer to Russia.
Let me jump in here. I'd like to give the last word to Martin. What is next for Hong Kong and for the mainland?
Well, I think the movement has subsided. I think it's peaked. I think it'll go into decline. I'm not saying it won't re-emerge in some form or another, but, you can't carry on with that level of demonstration and so on. They were essentially, as far as I can see, mainly students. So there's always a volatility and also a fickleness generally about student movements. I think that the majority of Hong Kong people actually either actively support the Chinese proposals or are prepared to go along with them as the practical next step. And I think that is what basically will happen. There might be the odd concession here and there, but I think it'll subside. I think that Hong Kong, I very much expect Hong Kong to remain part of China, one country, two systems. They need to develop the idea of what one country is. That needs to become much more present.
Okay, on that note, gentlemen, we've run out of time. I want to thank my guests, Martin, Andrew, and Mark, sitting here with me in Voice of Russia's Moscow studio. You've been listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Stay with the Voice of Russia. Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Protests, democracy demands, outside meddling, regime change, and the future of China. All of these issues have put Hong Kong in the spotlight. Have the students and Beijing both blinked at this point? And what is next? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Martin Jakes. He is the author of When China Rules the World. We also have Andrew Leung. He's the CEO of Andrew Leung International Consultants Limited, a company founded in London and reincorporated in Hong Kong. And sitting with me here in Moscow is Mark Sleboda. He is an international affairs and security analyst. Martin, if I can go to you first. When you look at the hierarchy of issues related to the protests in Hong Kong, what is the most important issue to you? Is it really a deficit of democracy? Is it the economy? It's Beijing worried about the periphery? What's your take? What's the most important issue?
Well, I think the most important issue is the issue of governance of Hong Kong, and in this context, the issue of democracy, and which means, in this context, the electoral law, and how the 2017 election is going to be organized. But of course, one cannot understand this issue in the abstract, and we have to have a clear understanding of what happened in 1997, the notion of one country, two systems, what is the relationship between China and Hong Kong, how has it been changing, and how has Hong Kong itself been changing?
Andrew, do you want to pick up on that? Because the Western media likes to use the democracy issue, and I think all of us here on the panel would agree that the democracy is an issue, but it's not the only issue. Others will look at it as Hong Kong making...
Under the colonial rule. I mean, Hong Kong has been voted the freest economy in the world for the 20 years in a row by the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Now, you can't have being voted the freest economy in the world without a vibrant civil society, without the freedoms and liberties underpinning a free economy. So that's, people are wondering, so why all this protest all of a sudden? So
all of a sudden, okay, let me go to Mark here, because Andrew, I'm really glad you brought up that video, because I saw a similar video, 6 months ago, Mark, about a Ukrainian, it was a Ukrainian girl, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Mark, why don't you tell our listeners? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we saw this video of a Ukrainian girl who actually didn't turn out in the end, of course, to be a Ukrainian girl by a Western production company that has intimate links in with certain political forces.
Some kind of play of its own identity. It's an identity issue as it is absorbed slowly into China proper. How important is that?
Well, it is extremely important, identity issue. And then this question of identity is well captured in a video short of the New York Times showing a young girl, a lady protester, and she probably educated abroad, and she realizes that that's the students know that they can't change the system, but they have certain ideals, because they ideals about democracy, about freedoms, and a lot of these young students, they were born after the handover. They've not experienced the kind of colonial rule, old-timers like me, have lived through, and can compare the kind of freedoms Hong Kong have been enjoying since the handover with what it was.
That are well known for exploiting dissent in foreign countries within Western governments.
Okay, so ergo, what are you saying?
It's a playbook. This is a rule from a playbook. There is a definite script being written out here, and I think it's quite disingenuous that certain political forces in Hong Kong and abroad are exploiting the idealism of and the faces, most importantly, of 15, 16, and 17-year-old
one of the things that's very interesting, if I can go back to Martin, one of the things in looking at Western media coverage of what's going on in Hong Kong, you keep coming across the word, they're so cute, aren't they? They're so cute. The white paper discussing the 2017 election, is this a red herring? Or is this really something so important to these young people? Because we had the political forces in Hong Kong, and then all of a sudden the students came and kind of grabbed the mantle here and pushed it forward. How important was that white paper?
Well, I think the white paper is very important in the sense